They said it was just another rap rumor. They were dead wrong. Because what just spilled out about him in the game is not gossip, it is not fan fiction, and it is not some Reddit thread theory cooked up at 3 in the morning. It is a 10-year-old secret that just got confirmed by the one man who was actually inside the machine when it all fell apart. Top Dawg did not tweet it. He did not hint at it on a live stream. He picked up the phone, called directly into a live interview, and told the world exactly why the king of Compton has kept the game on ice for years, and the reason has Drake's fingerprints all over it. One night, one music video, one visit to Compton that allegedly ended with Drake rushing out of the very city he was filming in, and a quiet little fracture that would go on to reshape the entire West Coast power map. And the craziest part? Almost nobody outside of that circle even knew the wound existed until now. Stay locked in, because by the end of this video you are going to understand why a phone call the game has been waiting on for years still goes unanswered, why a video shoot from 2015 is suddenly the most important piece of hip-hop archaeology on the internet, and why the people defending Drake's name in Compton are doing it with a very specific, very telling choice of words. You are going to walk away understanding how one afternoon in a neighborhood most of you have only ever seen through a music video lens managed to snap a mentor and student bond that the entire culture assumed was unbreakable. And you are going to walk away with the uncomfortable realization that the biggest rap war of the modern era did not begin where you thought it began. It began years earlier, on a block, in front of cameras, with a smile on everyone's face and a knife already halfway out of its sheath. So let us set the table properly, because this story does not start in 2015. It starts way earlier, back when he was just a hungry kid from Compton with a mixtape and a cosign he had not fully earned yet. See, before the platinum plaques, before the Pulitzer, before Kendrick became the most feared pen in the entire industry, there was a window of time where the biggest West Coast star alive was the game. And the game, say what you want about the chaos that follows him everywhere, has always had one quality that even his enemies respect. He puts people on. He absolutely did it for Kendrick Lamar. Game brought Kendrick onto records when radio would not touch him. Game shouted his name in interviews when nobody outside of Compton knew who he was. Game wrapped his arm around the kid and told the industry, this is next. That is not a small thing in hip-hop. In a culture built on who vouched for you, that kind of early endorsement is basically a blood debt. You do not forget who held the door open for you. You are not supposed to forget. That is the rule. That is the code that keeps this entire genre from collapsing under the weight of its own egos. And for a while, that relationship looked untouchable. The game was the established general. Kendrick Lamar was the rising prince. Top Dawg Entertainment was building its own empire in the background, and everybody was eating. They collaborated. They showed up for each other. Compton had a past, a present, and a future all standing in the same frame. If you were watching back then, you would have bet everything you owned that game and Kendrick were locked in forever. Mentor and student. 2 generations of the same city, carrying the same flag. Photos of them together used to circulate the internet with captions about legacy, about torch passing, about the beautiful continuity of a neighborhood that had produced more culture-defining art than any 6 square miles in America. Except somewhere along the way, the call stopped getting answered. Fans started noticing it in fragments first. The game would mention him in interviews, and it would always be love, always praise, always respect, never a single sideways word. But the love was only traveling in one direction. Kendrick, famously private, famously surgical about who gets access to him, simply stopped engaging. No features, no appearances, no public moments. Game would reach out, and the silence on the other end was loud enough to hear through the screen. And here is what made it so confusing. There was no incident anyone could point to. No diss record. No stolen beat. No argument on camera. Nothing. Just a slow, cold fade from one of the most important relationships the city had produced in 20 years. It was the kind of estrangement that made the internet feel like it was missing a chapter of the book, like someone had ripped out the pages that connected the beginning to what followed. Theories floated around for years. Some people said Kendrick Lamar simply outgrew the association, that once he became a global artist, he could not afford the baggage that comes with the game's unpredictable energy. Some said it was business, label politics, TD protecting its crown jewel from outside noise. Some said it was jealousy in reverse, that Game secretly resented what Kendrick had become and Kendrick had picked up on it. And some people, the ones who always sensed there was a body buried somewhere, insisted it had to be something personal, something specific, something that happened on a particular day that nobody was talking about. They were the ones scrolling through old footage looking for the exact moment the energy flipped. They were the ones cross-referencing timelines. They were the ones who kept saying, in every comment thread, that something must have happened, and we just were not in the room when it did. Turns out that third group was right. Because according to Top Dawg himself, calling into that interview with zero warning, the reason Kendrick Lamar does not rock with the game anymore comes down to one decision Game made back in 2015. One decision that, at the time, probably felt like nothing more than a smart business move and a huge look for the city. Game brought Drake to Compton to shoot a music video. Now if you just heard that and shrugged, that is it? A music video? Then you do not understand Compton, you do not understand hip-hop loyalty, and you definitely do not understand the temperature that already existed between Drake and the TD camp in 2015. Because bringing Drake into the heart of Compton at that exact moment was not a neutral act. It was, depending on who you ask, either a beautiful moment of unity or a loaded political move that crossed a line nobody had officially drawn, but everybody knew was there. And the man Kendrick Lamar apparently holds responsible for opening that gate is the game. Let me say this clearly so nobody gets it twisted. None of this was public knowledge. Kendrick Lamar never explained it. He has built an entire career on saying almost nothing and letting the music detonate on his behalf. The game never aired out the grievance either. He just kept showing love into a void and letting the internet wonder why. The only reason we are even having this conversation right now is because Top Dawg decided to pick up a phone and give the culture a piece of history it had been starving for. And once you hear what allegedly happened on that video set, once you hear the details about how that day actually went, the silence from Kendrick starts making a whole lot more sense. But hold on. Because before we get to the set, before we get to the moment things went sideways, you need to understand exactly who the kid from Compton was in 2015, exactly where Drake stood in the culture at that precise second, and why the idea of those two forces colliding on Compton soil was, to people who pay attention, like watching somebody carry a lit match into a room full of gasoline. The tension was already there. It had been building for 2 years. And the fuse, believe it or not, was a verse that had nothing to do with Compton at all. To really feel the weight of this, you have to rewind to 2013, because that is the year the kid from Compton did something that polite hip-hop society is never supposed to do. He called everybody out by name. The control verse. If you were anywhere near the culture that summer, you remember exactly where you were when it dropped, because it did not behave like a normal guest feature. It behaved like a declaration of war. Kendrick got on that record and, with a calm that was honestly scarier than shouting, listed off the biggest names in the game. And yes, Drake was on that list, and told them all, essentially, I am coming for your spot, and I am going to be friends with none of you while I do it. The internet melted. Rappers who were not even mentioned got offended. Rappers who were mentioned scrambled to respond. And Drake, the biggest commercial force in the genre, was suddenly sitting in a very uncomfortable seat, because the verse framed him not as the untouchable hit machine, but as just another name on a hit list. Radio stations were playing the verse in loops. Barbershops turned into debate halls. Every podcast in existence spent an entire week trying to unpack whether it was a declaration of war or a declaration of intent. And if you are being honest, that distinction has never really existed in hip-hop. Intent is war. Everybody knew. Now here is the thing about Drake that people who cover him sometimes miss. He does not forget. He smiles, he jokes, he plays it cool in interviews. But the subliminals that started flying in the months after Control told a completely different story. Little jabs and verses. Little lines everyone understood were aimed at the kid from Compton. And Kendrick never backed down an inch. Award show moments. The BET cipher. Subtle shots answered by subtler shots. It was a Cold War conducted entirely in subtext. Two of the biggest rappers alive circling each other while publicly insisting there was nothing to see. Interviewers would ask both men about the other, and both men had perfected the same dance. A little smile, a diplomatic word, a change of subject. But if you watched the eyes, if you paid attention to the tightness of the jaw when the wrong name got mentioned, you knew. Everyone in the culture knew. It was the worst kept secret in music. That was the atmosphere when the calendar flipped to 2015. And 2015 is the year his whole aura gets complicated. The Meek Mill situation exploded, the ghostwriting accusations, the back-to-back onslaught. Drake was fighting a public war on one front and quietly managing a cold war on another. And right in the middle of all of that, with tensions simmering and everybody choosing sides whether they admitted it or not, the game made his move. He was working on his album. He had a massive record on his hands, and he decided the video for it needed to be an event. Not just a video, a statement. The record was called 100. It featured Drake, and Game decided they were going to shoot it in the one place on earth that meant the most to him and the least to an outsider, Compton. Now, on paper, I understand exactly why that sounds beautiful. One of the biggest artists on the planet, coming to the most storied neighborhood in hip-hop to film a video with the city's general. The imagery writes itself. Drake on the block. Drake with the homies. Drake paying respect to the soil that produced NWA, that produced Game himself, that was at that very moment producing Kendrick Lamar's rise. From a marketing perspective, it was genius. And to be fair to the Game, his heart was probably in a genuine place. He has always been the guy who wants to bring the world to Compton, who wants to be the bridge between his neighborhood and the industry machine. He has said in interview after interview that his life's mission is to make his city visible to people who have only heard about it through nightly news broadcasts. Bringing the biggest artist in the world to his neighborhood was, in his mind, the ultimate proof of concept. But put yourself inside the mind of the TD camp. Because from their side of the fence, this did not look like unity. This looked like the city's loudest representative rolling out a red carpet for the one outsider who was already in a cold war with their crown jewel. It looked like an invitation being extended on behalf of a city that had not been consulted. And in a culture where geography is identity, where who you stand next to says everything, bringing him into the heart of Compton in 2015 was not a video shoot. It was a political act. And whether Game intended it or not, and most people believe he did not intend it maliciously, the message that landed on the other side of the fence was brutal in its simplicity. Game chose a side. Or at the very least, he refused to acknowledge that sides existed. And in a chess game, refusing to acknowledge the board is not neutrality. It is the exact same thing as making the wrong move. And y'all, this is the part that had been whispers for almost a decade. Because the shoot did not go smoothly. Something happened on that set. Something that allegedly had Drake leaving Compton a whole lot faster than he arrived. The details have been guarded for years by people who clearly decided this story was not theirs to tell. But pieces have started leaking out through interviews, through offhand comments, through producers and street figures who were actually there. And when you put those pieces together, you start to understand why Kendrick never picked up the phone again, and why the men who speak for Compton get very specific, very careful, and very deliberate when they describe exactly how welcome the outsider was on that soil. Keep that thought right where it is, because we are about to walk through exactly what one of the most credible street voices in the city said when he was asked, point blank, whether Drake could ever come back to Compton. He did not say no. He did not say yes either. What he said was something far more surgical and far more revealing than either. So let us talk about that day in 2015, because this is where the story stops being about industry politics and starts being about the streets. The video for 100 was supposed to be a coronation. The Game had Drake in his city, cameras rolling, the neighborhood out, the whole scene staged to look like the culture at its most unified. And for a few hours, that is exactly what it was. But according to the accounts that have surfaced since, and this is allegation layered on allegation, filtered through years of people choosing their words like they are defusing something, at some point during that shoot, the energy shifted. Something went down in the area. The details have never been laid out in full, and the people who know the specifics have shown zero interest in laying them out. But the consequence is the part nobody disputes. Drake ended up leaving. Fast. Fast enough that, according to the retelling, people on the other end had to actually get on the phone with him afterward and reassure him that everything was fine, that he was good, that he could come back. Now sit with that for a second, because the framing of that detail matters enormously. The framing was not that Drake faced pressure. The exact framing was that he was uncomfortable, that he had never been around that level of genuine street presence before, that when the reality of the environment made itself known, his instinct was to get distance. And listen, most human beings on this planet would be uncomfortable in that situation. That is not the scandal. The scandal is what happened next, or more accurately, what did not happen next. Because the story of that day did not stay on that block. Stories like that never do. They travel. They get retold in rooms you are not in front of audiences that include some very influential figures with very long memories. And somewhere along that chain, the narrative hardened into something that certain people in the TD orbit were never going to forget. It became folklore. It became a piece of coded history passed between insiders who understood, without ever saying it aloud, what the story meant and who it indicted. Because now look at the whole picture the way Top Dawg apparently sees it. From that vantage point, the Game did not just bring an outsider into the city. He brought an outsider who was already in a quiet war with their artist, put him on hallowed ground for a photo opportunity, and then the day ended with that outsider allegedly hurrying out of the neighborhood while the city watched. Whether that is fair or not is almost beside the point. In the logic of that world, the embarrassment does not attach itself to Drake. It attaches itself to the man who issued the invitation. That is how this works. When you bring somebody to the cookout and it goes wrong, the culture does not blame the guest. It asks who vouched for him. It asks who thought that person was ready for the environment. It asks who spent the city's credibility on someone who could not carry it. And in that particular arithmetic, The guest walks away with his reputation dented but survivable. The host, on the other hand, gets marked forever as the man whose judgment cannot be trusted at the door. And this is where we have to talk about the second witness, because the account did not come from just one direction. The producer Hit Boy, and if you know his resume, you know his word carries weight. This is a man who has made records for everyone from Jay-Z and Kanye to Kendrick himself, had already hinted at this story in a separate interview. When he was asked about that day, he did not spill the details. In fact, he made a point of not spilling them. But what he confirmed was the shape of the event, that Drake essentially had to get out of Compton, and that it was definitely connected to Drake himself. No elaboration. No names beyond that. Just confirmation that the day went sideways in a way significant enough that a Grammy-winning producer still remembers it as a story he will not fully tell on camera. And that alone should tell you everything about how serious this was. Because Hit Boy is not a man who trades in gossip. He is not on Instagram Live starting drama. He is a working professional whose entire career has been built on being the guy in the room who does not repeat what happens in the room. When a man like that confirms even the outline of an incident, it is because the outline has been confirmed to him from so many directions that denying it would insult his own intelligence. Two independent sources. Same shape. Same day. Same conclusion. And now, 10 years later, Top Dawg picks up a phone and connects the final wire, telling the world that this exact incident, this exact video, this exact decision by the game, is the reason Kendrick Lamar does not answer that man's calls. That is not a rumor anymore. That is as close to an official explanation as this culture is ever going to give us, delivered by the one person on earth with the standing to deliver it. But if this incident is really the reason for a decade of silence, it raises a question that cuts way deeper than one video shoot. Why did Kendrick Lamar take it that personally? Because Kendrick does not do grudges casually. For him to hold this for 10 years, the offense had to mean something much bigger than a bad afternoon on a video set. And to understand what it meant, you have to understand what Compton actually represents to Kendrick Lamar, not as a hometown, but as a code. Rules about who gets access, who gets vouched for, and what it costs when somebody sells that access cheap. That code is the real main character of this entire story. To Kendrick, Compton is not scenery. It is not a backdrop for content. It is a living code of conduct that you either honor or you do not, and there is no middle lane. Listen to the music. Really listen. And you hear this obsession running through everything he has ever made. Good Kid, Mad City is not just an album about growing up in Compton. It is a documentary about the rules of surviving it. Who you ride with. Who you vouch for. What happens when outsiders misunderstand the temperature of the room. Every era of Kendrick Lamar's career is, underneath the poetry, a meditation on access. Who earns it? Who abuses it? And what it costs when somebody hands it out carelessly. To Pimp a Butterfly extended that meditation from the block to the industry. Damn. Turned it inward and made it a spiritual accounting. Even Mr. Morale, an album most fans read as therapy, is at its core still about the same subject. What you owe the people who raised you, and what happens to your soul when you owe more than you can pay. So when the game brought Drake to Compton in 2015, he was not, in Kendrick's apparent worldview, making a fun video with a pop star. He was exercising a currency that did not fully belong to him. He was spending the city's credibility that men bled for, that generations built. And he was spending it on a man who, at that exact moment, was the opposition. And when the day ended with that opposition allegedly hurrying back to safety, the whole transaction looked, from a certain angle, like a sale that embarrassed the seller. Compton did not look like a fortress that day. It looked like a set. And for an artist whose entire identity is fused to the idea that Compton is sacred ground, that perception alone might have been enough to close the door on the game forever. Now, is that fair to Game? Honestly, this is where the debate gets interesting, because there is a legitimate counter-argument, and plenty of people have been making it loudly since this story broke. The Game has never claimed to be anyone's gatekeeper. His entire brand, from day one, has been about opening doors, not guarding them. He put Kendrick Lamar on before anyone. He has put countless younger artists on since. That is simply who the man is. From his side of the table, bringing Drake to Compton was probably one of the proudest moments of that entire album cycle. He brought a global superstar home. He showed the world his neighborhood. He got to stand on his own soil next to the biggest name in music and say, "This is where I am from." If you cannot understand why that felt like a triumph to him, you have never come from a place the world only talks about in stereotypes. To a man like Game, who has spent his entire life fighting the caricature the outside world tries to project onto Compton, bringing the world's biggest artist to walk his block was not treason. It was validation. It was proof that the neighborhood he loved was no longer just a headline. It was a destination. And yet, And this is the tension that makes this story impossible to put down. Good intentions do not erase consequences in a code-based culture. Game may have been acting out of pride and generosity, but the decision still had a blast radius, and the shrapnel landed on the most sensitive fault line in hip-hop at the worst possible moment. The two of them were already locked in their quiet war. The city was already watching who stood where. And in that environment, there is no such thing as an innocent photo op. Every move is a chess move, whether the person making it realizes they are playing or not. Game thought he was directing a music video. TD apparently believes he made a move on a board he did not fully respect. And 10 years later, the scoreboard of that disagreement is written in unanswered phone calls. Meanwhile, his position in all of this is its own fascinating layer. For years, his relationship with the West Coast has been this strange, arm's-length thing. Enormous popularity, enormous streams, but a persistent question mark over his authenticity in the eyes of the coast's most respected voices. And here is a story, now publicly confirmed by the head of TD, in which Drake came to the most symbolically loaded neighborhood in hip-hop, filmed for a few hours, allegedly got uncomfortable when the reality of the environment surfaced, and left with people having to phone him to smooth it over. Whatever else that story does, it does not add armor to Drake's street credibility. And notably, he has never once addressed it. Not in a verse, not in an interview, not anywhere. For an artist who responds to nearly everything, that silence speaks with a remarkably loud voice. Drake has built a career on being able to talk his way through any narrative. He has clapbacks for everything. But this specific story, the one about the afternoon in Compton, has been circulating in some form for years, and the man has never once picked up the microphone to counter it. That is not an accident. Silence, for an artist as verbose as Drake, is its own kind of confession. And that silence sets up the most revealing moment in this entire saga. The moment a respected street figure sat down in an interview chair, got asked directly whether Drake could come back to Compton, and gave an answer so perfectly calibrated that people are still dissecting it line by line. Because what he said sounded, on the surface, like a warm welcome. It was anything but. Let us get into exactly what was said, word by word, because the devil in this story is absolutely in the delivery. The interview in question is one of those moments that hip-hop internet is going to be clipping and reposting for years, because on the surface it sounds like nothing, and underneath the surface it sounds like everything. The man being asked was a respected Compton figure, the kind whose presence in the city is not debated, whose history is not questioned. When he talks about who can and cannot move through the neighborhood, people understand he is not guessing. He was being asked about the game bringing Drake to Compton to shoot that video, and the interviewer put it to him as directly as a question can be put. Can Drake come to Compton? And the answer came back smooth as glass. Of course he can. That man can go wherever he pleases. Ain't nobody out to harm him. Nobody is worried about him. Now, if you stopped listening right there, you would walk away thinking the city had issued Drake a lifetime pass. And I suspect that is exactly how the answer was designed to be heard by anyone half paying attention. But then came the turn. One of the coldest I have ever heard anyone execute without ever raising their voice or breaking their smile. Because after saying nobody was worried about Drake, he explained why. He said Drake is no threat to anybody. And then he said the line that the entire internet has been chewing on ever since. He said, "That's Aubrey. That's Aubrey. Not Drake. Aubrey." For anyone who does not immediately feel the temperature drop in that sentence, let me explain why it landed like a slap wrapped in a handshake. Drake's government name is Aubrey Graham. And in hip-hop, calling a man by his government name in a discussion about street credibility is a very old, very deliberate rhetorical move. It strips the persona. It peels off the stage armor and points at the person underneath it. When this man looked into that camera and said that's Aubrey, what he was communicating, without ever saying anything that could be clipped as a threat, without ever giving anyone a single thing to be outraged about, was that the city does not see Drake. The city sees a kid named Aubrey who once came to shoot a video and, allegedly, could not get out of there fast enough when the environment showed its real face. The message was, he is not dangerous to us, he is not important to us, he is not even Drake to us. He is Aubrey. And Aubrey can go wherever he pleases, because Aubrey does not matter enough to stop. It is the linguistic equivalent of holding a door open for someone with an exaggerated bow. Technically polite, actually devastating. That is not a welcome. That is a dismissal so complete it does not even need to raise its voice. And the interviewer caught the blade hiding inside the bouquet, because he followed up with the question that mattered. If it was all good, then why did the man pull up to that video shoot and, as the story goes, damn near run? And the answer he got is the reason we know the street's version of this story at all. The man admitted that yes, something happened that day. He claimed he forgot the specifics. And you can decide for yourself how much of that forgetting is genuine and how much is strategic. But he conceded the frame of the event. Something went down. And when pressed on whether it was about Drake, he gave the answer that does all the work. It wasn't about Drake, but it was. And then, the detail that turned a rumor into a legend. He said that when Drake saw certain figures appear, when the real faces of that world made themselves visible, he got up out of there, and afterward people had to get on the phone with him and tell him, "Man, you good, come back." He got up out of there. They had to call him and tell him he was good. That is the image. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic showdown. Just a man deciding, in real time, that the room was more real than he was prepared for, and a city that remembers it 10 years later with a smile. And here is what makes that testimony so dangerous for his narrative. It does not accuse him of anything he can sue over or even argue with. It does not call him a coward. It just describes him as a tourist who got spooked by the scenery, delivered by a man smiling the entire time. There is no comeback record for that. There is no bar you can write that undoes. That's Aubrey. And that is exactly why, when Top Dawg finally confirmed that this afternoon is the reason Kendrick Lamar closed the door on the game, the entire culture understood immediately which side of that memory Kendrick was standing on. Now let us talk about the man on the other end of those unanswered calls, because the game's side of this story is the part that actually hurts to look at. Whatever you think of him, and the man has spent 20 years making sure everyone has an opinion, his loyalty to Kendrick has never once wavered in public. Not once. While Kendrick was ascending to a level of prestige almost no rapper in history has touched, his old mentor was in the front row cheering, telling anyone with a microphone that this was the king, that Compton had produced the greatest of a generation. He has defended Kendrick in rooms Kendrick will never know about. And he has done all of it into a silence so total that at this point it has its own gravity. Think about what that actually feels like. This is a man who held the door open before anyone else would. A man who staked his own credibility on Kendrick when Kendrick was a risk. And the repayment was not beef. Beef would almost be easier, because beef is at least a relationship. The repayment was absence. No feature. No callback. Just year after year of the game, sending love into a void while the world watched and wondered why. And the truly brutal detail in this whole saga is that Game apparently never even knew the reason. He was not frozen out over something he did to Kendrick directly. He was frozen out over a 2015 decision he almost certainly remembers as one of the best days of that album cycle, the day he brought the biggest artist in the world home to his block. He has been serving a sentence for years without ever being told the charge. And the only reason he knows the charge now, if he knows it at all, is the same reason you do, because Top Dawg picked up a phone and told an interviewer. That is a genuinely Shakespearean structure hiding inside a rap story. The mentor punished for an act of generosity. The student whose silence is more devastating than any diss record. The kingmaker who learns the verdict from the news like everyone else. And it raises the question that has been splitting the comment sections in half since this broke. Is Kendrick Lamar justified? Or has the coldest pen in hip-hop also got the coldest heart? Because the case against Kendrick practically writes itself. 10 years of silence over a video shoot. A decade of freezing out the man who believed in him first, over a decision that man made with pride and love for his city. If the story ended there, it would be a simple tale of a superstar who got too big to remember where the ladder started. It would be the kind of thing every generation of hip-hop fans complains about. The ungrateful protege forgetting the mentor the second the spotlight moved on. But Kendrick's version of events, the version he has never spoken aloud but that his entire career argues on his behalf, is built on a different foundation. In Kendrick's world, the Compton cosign is not a party favor. It is the most valuable currency in West Coast hip-hop, and it is supposed to be defended like it. He watched the city get used as a photo backdrop for a man who was, at that moment, his quiet opposition. He then watched that outsider allegedly fold under the mildest pressure and have to be called and reassured like a kid who got scared at a sleepover. And he watched all of it get packaged and sold to the world as unity. From that vantage point, the game did not just make a bad political call. He devalued the one asset Kendrick had sworn to protect, the meaning of Compton itself. And a man who communicates in albums rather than arguments, responded the only way he knows how. He removed his presence. Completely. Permanently. No announcement, no drama, no explanation. Just gone. It is the most Kendrick response imaginable. The man who lets his art detonate while he says nothing simply extended that philosophy to a friendship. And here is the detail that elevates this from a rap squabble into something closer to mythology. He was right. Not necessarily right to freeze out Game. That is for the culture to argue about. And believe me, it is arguing. But right about the opposition. Right about the temperature. Right about who was actually standing on that block that day. Because everything that has happened since 2015, every subliminal that hardened into open feud, the entire eruption of the most watched rap battle of the modern era, has confirmed that the Cold War Kendrick was guarding against in 2015 was not paranoia. It was prophecy. He was not being petty about a video shoot. He was watching a door get opened that, in his reading of the board, was never supposed to open. And a decade later, with the benefit of everything we watched happen between those two men, it is genuinely hard to call Kendrick's instinct wrong. History has a funny way of relitigating old decisions. Choices that looked cold in the moment start looking like foresight once the story finishes writing itself. And the story between Kendrick and Drake has now finished writing itself in the most public, most streaming record-breaking way possible. Every fan who once thought Kendrick was being paranoid in 2015 has had to sit with the fact that he was, in fact, reading the room before the rest of us even knew there was a room. But wait, because there is still one more layer underneath all of this that almost nobody is talking about, and it might be the most important one. Why now? Why, after 10 years of disciplined silence from every single party involved, did Top Dawg suddenly decide that this was the moment to pick up a phone and hand the culture this piece of history? Because men like that do not talk by accident. There is always a reason. And the timing of this revelation tells us something about where the board is moving next. Because make no mistake, the timing of Top Dawg's revelation is not random. Think about the landscape this story just landed in. The war between those two men is no longer a cold war in subliminals. It is the defining public conflict of this era, decided in streaming numbers, and settled, in the eyes of most of the culture, with Kendrick standing on top of the rubble. The conversation has already started shifting from who won to what it all meant. And right on cue, at the exact moment the culture is re-examining every chapter of this rivalry, the head of TD reaches back 10 years and places a brand new artifact on the table. An origin story. A piece of evidence that reframes the entire timeline and says, in effect, you think this started when you noticed it. It did not. We have known exactly who was standing on the other side of that line since 2015, and we have the receipts to prove we never forgot. That is not gossip. That is narrative warfare executed at the highest level. Because what this revelation accomplishes, strategically, is devastating in its elegance. It retroactively casts Kendrick not as a man who woke up one day and chose war, but as a man who spent a decade watching, remembering, and waiting, whose restraint was not passivity but patience. Every fan now rereads the saga with a new lens. The silence toward Game was not coldness, it was discipline. The eruption was not impulsive, it was a debt finally called due. And simultaneously, it strips yet another layer of armor off Drake. Because now the culture has a street-certified story, confirmed from the top of the TD pyramid, of Drake allegedly hurrying out of Compton and needing to be called and told he was safe. In the economy of rap credibility, that single image, that's Aubrey, is worth more damage than 100 diss lines, because it cannot be rapped against. You cannot bar your way out of a reputation. You cannot punchline your way out of a story that has been quietly circulating in the exact rooms whose respect you have spent your entire career trying to buy. And where does this leave the game? In the strangest position of all. Because this revelation is, in a weird way, the first genuine communication he has received from the TD camp in years, an explanation delivered through the media instead of a phone call, which is its own message. He finally knows why the door closed. But he learned it the same way you and I did, and there is something almost unbearably hip-hop about that. The culture giveth the cosign, and the culture taketh away the closure. The question now is whether this public explanation becomes the crack in the ice, whether an explanation offered to the world might, ironically, be the thing that finally makes a private conversation possible. Do not count on it. 10 years of silence does not melt because of one phone call into an interview. But stranger resurrections have happened in this genre, and if the game has proven anything across 2 decades, it is that he does not stop showing love just because nobody is clapping back. He has watched former friends become icons and still shown up to clap at their milestones. He has watched former allies close ranks around him and still refused to trash talk them in public. Whatever else you say about the man, he does not shrink from a room just because that room has stopped acknowledging he is in it. So now the whole board looks different. What seemed, for a decade, like an inexplicable Cold War between a mentor and his greatest discovery turns out to have a body buried underneath it. A single afternoon in 2015, a video shoot that was supposed to be a coronation and ended as an exodus. A superstar allegedly rushing out of a neighborhood while the neighborhood memorized his face. And every piece of the modern era, every unanswered call, every one-sided interview full of praise, every subliminal that eventually exploded into open war. traces back to that one decision to bring the wrong guest through the wrong gate at the wrong time. It is the kind of origin story that makes you realize how much of what looks random in hip-hop is actually the delayed detonation of something very specific, something very old, something the public was never supposed to see. And there is one more angle we have to sit with, because it is the angle that gives this whole story its texture. Every party in this saga is, in their own way, telling the truth. The Game is telling the truth when he says he loves Kendrick and never meant harm, because he does, and he did not. Kendrick is telling the truth, in his silence, when he insists that the code matters more than any single friendship, because to him, it does. Dawg is telling the truth when he finally identifies the moment the wound formed, because that is the moment the men in his orbit have been pointing at for a decade. And even the Compton OG who looked into that camera and said that Aubrey is telling the truth in his own devastating way, because in his neighborhood, that name really does not carry the weight the world thinks it carries. Every one of these truths is real, and every one of them, stacked next to the others, forms a picture that no single truth alone could reveal. That is what makes this saga feel so much bigger than a rap dispute. It is a case study in how a culture built on codes actually functions when the codes are tested, how forgiveness and grievance coexist, how love can be genuine and still not be enough, how the smallest decision can bend the trajectory of an entire coast. But here is the question I cannot stop circling, and it is the one I am leaving on your doorstep tonight. Because if Dawg is telling the truth, and nothing in his history suggests he talks just to hear himself, then the story we just walked through is only the version of events that someone was willing to say into a microphone. Which means the real question was never what happened on that video set. The real question is what else from that era is still sitting in the memories of the men who were actually in those rooms, waiting for the day someone decides the culture is ready to hear it. If a decade-old video shoot can silently reshape the entire West Coast power structure for 10 years without the public knowing a thing, what else have they been sitting on all this time? And more importantly, whose name is attached to the next story that finally gets told? Because history has a rhythm. When one buried story surfaces, others tend to follow. The dam does not break all at once. It leaks. And once the leaking starts, the men who spent years guarding secrets start deciding, one by one, that maybe their version deserves to be on the record too. And look, I want to hear where you stand on this, because this one splits the room every single time. Was Kendrick right to ice out his old mentor for a decade over that video shoot? Was that loyalty to the code, or was it the coldest overreaction in hip-hop history? Does the Game deserve a phone call after everything he did to open the door for Kendrick in the first place? And be honest with me, when that Compton OG looked into the camera and said that's Aubrey, did you feel the temperature in the room drop too? Get in the comments and let me know which side of that gate you were standing on, because I read every single one. And if this deep dive rearranged how you see the last 10 years of this rivalry, you already know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell, because the next chapter of this story is already unfolding. And trust me, you're going to want a front row seat when it breaks. We are not done with this timeline. Not even close. The buried stories of this era are just starting to surface, and by the time the last one comes out, the map of hip-hop history you thought you knew is going to look completely, unrecognizably different. Stay ready, stay locked in, and keep your ear to the ground, because the next revelation is already forming somewhere, in a room you are not in, waiting for the right moment to walk into the light.